I'm Marilyn Peck, President of the San Marino Historical Society. I just want to take a minute to thank many of you who have become members of the Society. Without your support, we couldn't do many of the things we do in the community. Your canceled check is your receipt. We do not send receipts because those 32-cent stamps add up, and we can use those for other community services. I just want to let you know that we are selling for our fundraiser, our totes, and our shirts with the map of San Marino. If you're interested, after the program, we will be selling them. I want to thank you all again for coming, and I want to introduce Paul Crowley, our program chairman. We can start this exciting program. Paul?
Thanks, Marilyn. Thanks to everyone for being here. This is a nice turnout. We were scheduled for the Webb Theater next door, but for obvious reasons, the place is torn up. We moved it here, and I think that's to the advantage of everybody. Tonight's program is, before I mention tonight's program, I'm going to mention twice tonight the next program that we're going to have in March, which is the part 2 of Before the Colors Fade, World War II veterans, except this time we're going to feature women, we think. We're still trying to identify a couple of female heroes, but we will. And that date, Marilyn, in March, the 12th of March, Thursday. And 2 months after that, we're going to have the program on the Lindbergh flight. We have one of the leading experts on the Lindbergh flight that lives here in San Marino, Gene Weisenberg. He's one of the country's renowned experts on the 1927 flight of Charles Lindbergh, and that'll be over at the library. That'll be a very interesting program too. Tonight, we decided to have this program featuring Frank Wills discussing the crime history of San Marino. Crimes, scandals, other things. Frank is a local person. Frank was born and raised in Pasadena, moved out to Covina, went to Covina High School, graduated from Fresno State College. He's with the Pasadena Police Department for many years and came with us 5 years ago as our chief, a superlative chief of police, and a good public speaker. And Frank also, besides being a police chief, he's a good PR man. He really knows how to handle people nicely. He's just a super chief, as all of our chiefs have been. And we have some of our ex-chiefs here tonight, and Frank will introduce them. Frank worked up this program. Yesterday he had a 3-hour program planned, which was too long. So he decided to eliminate all the crimes or suspected crimes involving current well-known residents of San Marino. That cut the program down to about 40 minutes. He's going to be very discreet, so I don't want to see anybody worrying. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn this podium over to our Chief of Police, Frank Wills.
Thank you, Paul. It's going to be a long night if I can't get this thing to balance. You know, that last comment that Paul made is correct. We did cut some of the scandals short for tonight's presentation. You know, this is a nice setup, Marilyn, thank you, but there's one request that you obviously didn't hear. The only request I had is please do not have a light shining straight down on my bald spot. And you did that. John Bill's recording this. It may ruin the videotape. I hope not. You know, etiquette would normally dictate that you thank people at the end of a program instead of the beginning, but by some odd coincidence, oftentimes when I talk, about half the audience leaves before I'm done, frequently in the first 10 or 15 minutes. So I'd like to thank some people ahead of time. Again, Paul, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak, with apologies to Rotary and City Club and a lot of other community groups. These Historical Society meetings are absolutely my favorite thing to go to in the evening in San Marino, and I'm really honored to be able to speak tonight. Also like to thank Ken Veranda, who's not here, that was very helpful. For those of you that don't know it, Ken has a PhD in history and very knowledgeable about the factual things occurring in the city going back over 100 years. Is Frosty Foster here tonight? Frosty? Do I see him? Frosty Foster's not here. He spent dozens and dozens of hours doing research down at the city library and researched old newspaper articles and checked out books and really helped with a lot of research, and I appreciate his help as well. We have police department staff here, Tim Harrigan. Raise your hand, Tim. Gary Isaacs is here. Chris Peterson put all these boards together. And could I have all the members of the San Marino Police Department stand up, including Nancy Caver, our new super duper administrative secretary, so you can get a round of applause. Thank you. You citizens are very, very fortunate here, and these people are the reason why. Now for some special introductions. You know, in the long history of the department, I don't think we've ever had all three living ex-chiefs of San Marino together at one time. So this is an epical occasion for the police department. I hope it's meaningful to the community as well. The only chief that's not here tonight is Bob Sears. Bob Sears was chief from 1954. He came from the Pasadena Police Department as well. Stayed here for 4 years before moving along to the Arcadia Police Department. He is celebrating his 89th birthday tonight, and his family flew him up to the Bay Area, and he really feels bad that he can't make it, but he passed on his best to the San Marino community. The first chief I would like to introduce to you, ex-chief, he began his career with the San Marino Police Department in 1972. He was chief here in 1991 and 1992. He is now the police chief in the city of Glendora, a good friend, a great professional colleague, and a true professional. Paul Butler. Paul, would you stand up? He gave me some good counsel and advice before I came here. Our next chief, he joined the San Marino Police Department in 1951. He became chief in 1963, and at that time, he was the youngest police chief in the San Marino Police Department history, and still is. He holds that record. He retired in 1987. He's here tonight with his wife, Helen. Upon his retirement in 1987, he was the longest tenured police chief in the state of California. And to many of you, there's always been only one San Marino police chief, and that's a true gentleman and a good friend, James Moore, his wife, Helen. And then last but not least, next chief joined the San Marino Police Department in 1941. He became chief in 1958. He grew up in the San Marino area and remembers when Lacey Park was a lake. All right, used to play down there, do a little fishing as I understand it. When I called him up, he lives down in the San Diego area, and I said, well, he had to go and check with his doctor to make sure he could come up and make the trip tonight. And I said, do you want my number so you can call me back? He said, oh, I've got it memorized, Sycamore 22131. And I said, well, Chief, we changed that just a few years ago, I think. But he was chief from 1958 to 1963. On February 1st, he has his 95th birthday. Former chief of the San Marino Police Department, the first time he's been back in the city in 35 years, Chief Joseph Miller and his wife, Maudie. Chief. And Chief, up through last week, there was an incident that happened here in the 50s I'll tell you about later, and I could not find out what happened to the suspects, and Chief Miller was able to help me out. He's still got a mind of a steel trap. Listen, as I was going to Rotary today, as I was walking in the door, somebody called and says, so you're going to talk about where all the dead bodies are buried tonight? And I says, well, as a matter of fact, if you know, Rotary is held over at the Women's Club at the site of right next to Huntington Middle School. It says, as a matter of fact, most of the dead bodies in San Marino were buried right underneath it. So we're going to go, most of tonight's dialogue is going to go from 1913 onward, but to really have an appreciation for what's happened in this community historically, you need to understand some of the things that went on in the 1700s and 1800s. The site where Huntington Middle School stands right now, before it was the middle school, before it was built in 1918, it was the Cooper Ranch. Prior to that, it was called Pear Orchard. And prior to that, in the 1700s, it was an Indian village inhabited by the, I can never get this right, Sissicanogna Indians. They were pretty peace-loving Indians. Actually, they were kind of spoiled. They didn't need to worry about agriculture because there was plenty of game here, plenty of trees. They could just fend for themselves. They didn't have to dig wells. There was plenty of fresh running water. So even back in the 1700s, San Marino, it was a beautiful place to live. But they did have some enemies, and they tortured their enemies when they captured them. And they buried them on the site, which is now Huntington Middle School. Now, when they built, some of those through the years have come up through agriculture when it was ranch land. They discovered some of those bodies. But when they built Huntington Middle School in 1918, there was some dialogue about excavating the site. But before the age of political correctness, I guess the American Indians didn't have quite the public policy input that they do now, and that was never done. It cost too much, and we didn't want to wait to build the school. So some bodies are still buried there. Okay. You can't talk about the history of San Marino or crime without knowing about the Old Mill, which for those of you that are new to the city, located at 1120 Old Mill Road in San Marino. It was built between the years of 1810 and 1812. And one of the reasons the Old Mill is still standing is that it has walls. Many of the walls are 4 to 5 feet thick. And it wasn't built just to mill grain, which is a good thing, because within 20 years of building it, they found out it wasn't useful. The foundation cracked, water shot up, and they couldn't use it to mill their grain. And thank goodness they also built it to withstand earthquakes and to serve as a fortress against Indian attacks and to safeguard valuables from the Mission San Gabriel and area ranchos. A lot of the rancheros and the people that settled this area were out of town a lot, and they did keep some of their valuables at the old mill. Also, a little known fact was parts of the old mill were used as a jail for Indians only, and there were stockades there as well. And some of the Indians in the early years of the old mill were whipped, not regularly, but once in a while it happened there. But into the 1800s, San Marino didn't have a lot of Indian problems. In fact, some of the settlers, Hugo Reed is the most famous one, and in the 1840s he married an Indian woman, took her as a wife, Victoria Reed, and they were very instrumental in the development of this area. So we'll start, I want to talk about, in the mid-1800s, the first big area-wide manhunt involving a crime in San Marino. That was something that Hugo Reed was involved in. Hugo Reed was a businessman, but he was very popular in the area, and he was elected as a Justice of the Peace here in San Marino in 1843. Can anybody hear me? Everybody hear me okay in the back? Anybody not hear me? He was elected Justice of the Peace, really didn't want that job. It wasn't a natural fit for him. And at that time, there was a particularly violent Indian roaming this area, the area which is now Alhambra, San Gabriel, San Marino, Pasadena, and his name was Joaquin. And I should also ask a question. Anybody here under the age of 16? Under 16? If you were, you'd probably be embarrassed to raise your hand. That would kind of impact some of my comments tonight. Joaquin was a bad guy. He was Indian, a fierce-looking appearance. He did a lot of unspeakable things to the settlers in the area. He was a renegade. He was one of those that resisted secularization in the mission. He was a ward at San Gabriel Mission growing up, and as soon as he was old enough and strong enough, he escaped. And he had an odd look to him. He had a brand on his lip, an iron brand on his lip, and he had half of an ear cropped off by one of the ranch owners that tried to enslave him at a young age, and he carried those scars, obviously, in those days, with him the rest of his life. But everybody was scared of him, and Hugo Reed just wasn't up to the job. So they called on another famous San Marinian by the name of B.D. Wilson. I know many of you are familiar with him. B.D. Wilson was also known locally as Don Benito. You've heard of Don Benito School up in Pasadena. I will use those two names interchangeably, and sometimes it's confusing. But B.D. Wilson and Don Benito were one and the same. Now, Don Benito, if you're not aware of his background, everybody thinks of him as the guy that the agriculturist. He was the first big real estate developer here, and he made a fortune with selling wine and selling property and sending water down into housing tracts and ranchos that are now in Alhambra. But prior to that, he was a frontiersman and a fur trapper. At the age of 15, he learned to speak the Indian language. He was an expert marksman, a fur trader. He had a business at 15, trading with the Indians. And he came out here and settled in the area which is now San Marino. And everybody was so scared of this Indian Joaquin that they enlisted Don Benito to go track him down. Don Benito took a group of 22 men and tracked the Indian Joaquin all the way out to the base of the Santa Ana River, traced him up into the mountains, and they captured an Indian village in the process. When they captured an Indian village, he developed some rapport with some of the captives and got some information on how to find Joaquin. But they also noticed that there was a lot of bears in the area. There were 11 bears captured in a period of 48 hours. And he taught the other 21 members of his party how to trap bears and how to bring them back to camp and how to take the furs, and it was kind of an educational experience. But because of the number of bears in that area became known as Big Bear Lake. So if you have cabins, some of you I know do, in Big Bear Lake, there is a real connection between San Marino and Big Bear Lake. Anyway, that's why this is why I was going to take 3 hours tonight, because these are great stories. And if I leave out any of the details, you won't get the full flavor of it. So anyway, back to Joaquin. Don Benito was a man of action. He got tired with the slow pace of his comrades, so he left out ahead with one of his scouts. He went up the river and encountered 4 Indians walking down a trail. And the Indians looked pretty harmless. He approached the Indians and noticed that one of them had an iron brand on his lip and an ear cropped off. It was Joaquin. And Joaquin, having some street smarts himself, immediately realized that Don Benito was not a friendly guy. Joaquin took out his bow and arrow, and Don Benito lifted up his rifle. They both shot each other at the same time. Don Benito's shot went right through Joaquin's heart. All right, but Joaquin was a good shot too. He hit Don Benito in the shoulder with an arrow. It was a poisoned arrow. Don Benito was very sick for a couple years, a couple days, and ultimately survived. But the legend of Don Benito really grew from that. He was already a local legend for winning a fight with a bear, where the bear bit him through the chest, and Don Benito was able to shoot the bear, and he was already famous prior to that. Anyway, my next great San Marino story. J.C. Kewen, you've heard of Kewen Canyon, Kewen Road. Lacey Park, when it was a lake, it had many names, but one of the names was Kewen Lakes. Now, J.C. Kewen was a Southern military colonel, and he came out here, was very successful, but he also happened to be one of the first people incarcerated in new federal prison at Alcatraz, up in the Bay Area. In 1862, he was an outspoken opponent of the Lincoln administration, an outspoken opponent of the northern side of the Civil War, and he was arrested and taken to Alcatraz. And later, everybody down here loved that man so much, they signed a petition, and the government finally released him. Now, a couple more Indian stories, and the best one is coming up. As I mentioned, by the time the 1880s rolled around, Indian problems in this area were pretty much non-existent. I think there's a big myth that the American frontier progressed evenly across the United States, and that was not the case. In 1875, when General Custer met his maker in Montana, this area was very well civilized. We got along with the Indians, big developments here in the San Marino, Pasadena area, but which makes the first recorded major crime spree that happened right here in San Marino all the more interesting. At least I think so. Over a period of time in the 1880s, there are a number of cattle being stolen and butchered right here in the area which is now Oak Knoll and Mission, near a ranch. Now, initially they thought it was a bandito named Velasquez who has done this over the years, and his hideout was down in the Arroyo Seco area. But this was unusual because the people that were stealing the cattle actually butchered them right out in the middle of the street. So you were victimized double. Number one, you lost your cattle, and number two, you wake up in the morning and all these guts are hanging out all over the roadway in front of your house. All right. not popular. And the men, again, a lot of the men were away, and so the women were at times powerless to stop it. Anyway, so people deduced that it might be the work of some hostile Indians that were rumored to have returned to the area. Two individuals who lived in an old adobe house at the site which is now 1825 El Molino woke up one morning, and for the first time some of their cattle were missing. Mr. Richardson, and we don't have his first name. He was pretty angry. He and a friend, or he and his roommate, set off to find the people that were stealing them. They were supposed to be back at nightfall. One day passed. They didn't come back. The second day, the third day, they hadn't returned. So they set out a search party to try and find them. Both he and his roommate were found dead, face down in the dirt, in the area where the Colorado Street Bridge is now. And both of them had Indian arrows in their back. Okay, it's interesting for two reasons. Number one, these two inhabitants of San Marino hold the dubious distinction of being the last people in the recorded history of Southern California killed by bow and arrow by hostile Indians. It's the last time it happened in Southern California area that we know of. The second reason it's interesting is the adobe house they lived in 1825, El Molino, became a tourist attraction for a while. As of 1945, that old adobe was still standing. Everybody had forgotten about it, but it was still standing. And I've tried to contact the owner several times over the last month. I want to go up and look around up there. And Chris Peterson was there in the late 60s and early 70s. One of my lieutenants was a friend with somebody up there. And there was an old structure out back that didn't match the rest of the house, that had been plastered over. And we suspect that it still might be standing. If anybody knows, I'd love to hear about it. But I'm going to get up to that 1825 El Molino address before too long and find out about it. The next great story, probably of all the mysteries in San Marino, none is cloaked in more romance and intrigue than the legend of the buried treasure at the old mill. Who has heard of that? Buried treasure at the old mill? I want to see how. Then you got to hear about it. I'm sorry. All right. I was going to skip this over, not keep it. If you live in San Marino, you've got to know about this. A key part of our history here. And I first heard about this growing up. My grandmother came out to the Pasadena area in about 1905, and when I was growing up, we came to Lacey Park, our whole family, and I remember driving by the old mill, and my grandmother used to say that there's buried gold at that site, and nobody has ever found it. And I always remembered that. And then in the 1960s, when they first invented those metal detectors, or if they didn't invent them, they became popular and available to private citizens, we always wanted to go and buy one, and I wanted to buy one early and be the first one to go back there and find these untold riches, and then never got around to it. But anyway, remember I told you earlier that the old mill was a fortress, and we do know that they kept some valuables there, some of the valuables from the mission, some of the valuables from area ranchos. There was an old German miller that was sent up there to be a caretaker of that property. And legend has it, here's where it gets a little bit fuzzy, is that people trusted him so much. He was wanted for a political crime on the East Coast, and everybody knew he couldn't leave the San Marino area, so they trusted him. And for every time he took treasure, he kept a record of it and hid it at different places on the property. Drilled holes in the walls, hid it under oak trees, and did a lot of other stuff. But in a robbery attempt, he was stabbed and killed, and along with him, all the information about where this stuff was hidden. So people didn't know where rumor and fact merged, and this was going on from about the 1830s to the 1870s. Then something happened that made everybody believe it again, brought it back into the popular knowledge. In 1870, there were excavations in the old mill, and they found the casket of an old mission priest. All right? And around in the dirt area around the casket was some amount of gold coins. I don't know how much, but several gold coins. And that made everybody curious. Maybe there's more, but that area was so swamped with water they couldn't dig it out just then. So a lot of people searched it. The myth never died, but in 1928 it resurfaced again with a big article in the new San Marino Tribune. The San Marino Tribune started publication in 1928, and one of their first issues had the legend and the facts behind the buried treasure at the old mill. A year later, the LA Times had a front page article about it because there were some sewer contractors out digging in the area of Gainsborough Road and Cumberland. They had dug 10 feet underneath the surface and uncovered a 6-foot tunnel. Now, as soon as the LA Times published this, people locally that liked the legend says this must be the famous tunnel that connected the old mill to the mission. Nobody ever knows that that was actually built. Some of the skeptics said that there's no engineering ability to do it in those days. Some of the old-time San Marino residents said it had to be a water tunnel constructed by the San Gabriel Valley Water Company in the 1880s. But the people that wanted to believe the myth, they hired some people from a museum, a local museum, and they came out and they discovered tools from the early part of the 1800s. They discovered nails that were made in the period of about 1805 to 1810. So this gave more credence to the fact that it was, in fact, a treasure tunnel. After this article in the LA Times came out, the city had to construct fences around the construction site to keep hundreds and hundreds of people away from it. Anyway, the money has never been discovered. If it's there, it's still there as we speak, but it's been a hard legend to kill off. Real estate brochures as late as the 1930s advertised the fact that there was treasure at the old mill. In the 1930s, a play was produced in the city of Pasadena that ran for many, many months about the legend of the treasure at the old mill. So it's a myth that's existed for many, many years. Anyway, on to the modern era, which begins for us at the city's incorporation in 1913. The first scandal to hit this city after incorporation in 1913 was Kaiser's Folly. You've all heard of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Many of you don't know that he owned an estate on Old Mill. In fact, the carriage house to the Kaiser Wilhelm estate has been added on to, but the house at 984 Old Mill Road, it's a blue house, is the old carriage house for the Kaiser Wilhelm estate. Anyway, he owned that up through World War I when it was seized as alien property by the United States government. It returned to German ownership in the 1920s and 1930s. It was used for gambling. The police department had to attack that because there was rumors of prostitutes being run out of there. And in the 1930s, it became legitimate again when it was used as a German consulate. However, at the start of World War II in 1941, it was seized again as alien property by the government and never returned to Germany because somebody decided to burn it down during the war. This brings us into the roaring 20s in San Marino and talk for a moment about one of the most colorful characters ever to grace the stage here in San Marino. That's the former police chief, Ben F. Parker. A colorful character. He was appointed marshal in 1924, chief in 1927. He served until 1934. He's a great big guy, had a black waxed handlebar mustache. He rode around town on a motorcycle in those days. And George Patton was not the first one in San Marino to carry fancy weapons. George Patton's pearl-handled revolver. What Chief Parker carried around with him would be illegal nowadays. If you can see, I can't walk over there because I've got a microphone tail, thanks to David Bell. Thanks, Paul. You see at the bottom, there's that sawed-off shotgun. That's been a part of our lore here in San Marino. It's on a wall at our police station, but that was Ben Parker's personal weapon. Didn't believe in revolvers, didn't believe in any other weapons. That sawed-off shotgun is what Ben Parker carried with him throughout his career. He really was a character. He was also a friend of the LA police chief. I mean, we're in an era now where the chief of LA, I mean, he might return my call if I called him, but we're certainly not fast friends. He's a fine chief, but we don't get to socialize too much except at the annual chiefs retreats. But the then chief of LA, Lewis Oakes, and our chief, Ben Parker, were very good friends. Now, Lewis Oakes was quite a character. He was a womanizer. In 1927, LAPD chief Lewis Oakes was caught coming out of a sleazy hotel. He was drunk and had a prostitute on each arm. All right? Within 5 days, he was fired and lost his job as police chief. Parker disassociated himself from Lewis Oakes and apparently cleaned up his act because he was quite involved in the Republican Party later on in his career. And there's a report in our archives. There was one time when all this stuff was going on to the old mill, the buried treasure, the city council and the mayor took the chief out there and said, we can make a lot of money off of this. Doesn't matter if it's true or not, but we need to do a formal investigation and get some more publicity that we're doing a formal investigation into all this money. And Chief Parker's response was, it's all a bunch of hogwash, and the only way anybody's going to find any money in the old mill, Mayor, is if you bury it and ask somebody to dig it up. And I don't want any part of it. So I guess they didn't serve at the day-to-day pleasure of the council in those days, and you get away with that stuff. But in the Roaring 20s, a lot of railroad tracks behind Lorain Road were dug up for weapons for World War I. A lot of railroad cars, after we took the metal parts out, were abandoned on the San Gabriel Railroad tracks behind Lorain Road, and for the next 20 years were used as alcohol stills, especially during the Prohibition era. The famous Chapman Woods, right up here at the San Marino Pasadena border, before it had all the expensive homes up there, it was a hobo camp throughout the 1920s. And San Marino police would constantly go out there and roust hobos out of the area, which is now Chapman Woods. A lot of bootleggers in San Marino in the Roaring 20s making money. In 1928, there's a dead body discovered holding a Bible at San Marino Avenue in Santa Anita. We never discovered the identity of that individual. But the best story from the 1920s occurred in 1929 at the San Marino gambling house. San Marino was scandalized by a raid at the Old Mill gambling house. The press called it, I'm trying to quote exactly here, it was shocking that something like this could happen in the city of San Marino in 1920. Absolutely shocking. And that's a theme that's going to be repeated a little bit in the next half hour. Throughout the 1920s, Ben Parker and the chief in Pasadena were at wit's end over this house. Some people say they didn't want to make any arrests, but according to archives, Ben Parker wanted to make an arrest there. There's gambling going on there, there's prostitution going on there, but the problem was that the front door and the yard was in San Marino, and the city boundaries went right through the middle of the house. The rest of the house was located in Pasadena, and this was before mutual aid agreement, so this Pasadena chief didn't want to come down here and kick the front door in a San Marino house, and our chief, Parker, stated publicly that he didn't want to search a house that was really located in Pasadena. But community complaints about this place got so bad that in 1925 they conducted a raid. But this house was alarmed, it had guards. They did a raid on this house in 1925 and found nobody there. But they heard voices underneath the floorboards. But they couldn't find the entrance to those catacombs and left without ever making an arrest. But they got a little smarter. No action was taken for the next 4 years, and there's so many complaints, the federal government decided to step in, and the DA's office of LA County. So in February 1929, they conducted a raid of this house. I give you the address yet? 1090 Old Mill Road? Okay, 1090 Old Mill Road. There's a new house there, and we have the picture up here someplace. They raided the house. They arrested 15 San Marino men. And, as the papers reported, a number of, quote, rich San Marino women. They got $5,000 in roulette wheels, card tables, dice tables, made a number of arrests, and the house was closed down finally in 1929. From 1929 to 1943, there was a caretaker that lived there. But during those years, it was known as a San Marino Mystery House. And then later in the early 50s, the San Marino Ghost House. The caretaker left in 1943. And from 1943 to 1952, it was abandoned. And generations of San Marino kids would break into that house. There were hidden passageways. There were large rooms with no windows. There were catacombs. There were hidden panels in the walls. And finally, it was torn down in 1952 for redevelopment. But the fact that it was abandoned from 1943 to 1952 disproves a popular perception held in this community that Paul Crowley was not on the city council in 1943 to 1952. Because if he had been, the house would have been boarded up in 30 days and torn down 6 months later. But when it was torn down in 1952, a very uppity article in the San Marino Tribune says that the house has never been discussed in the better San Marino circles. Now, if anybody reads Cecilia Rasmussen of the LA Times, she writes a column called LA Scene. For 10 years, she has been working on this story. She has documentation, but she has never been able to go to print with it because she doesn't have art. She is looking for a picture of this house from any era. If anybody knows anybody in a community or former residents that may have a picture of 1090 Old Mill Road before 1952, you would be a hero to the LA Times, which is hard to do. The 1930s begin a 20-year period where there's a lot of small-town corruption in San Marino, a lot of prostitution and gambling on Old Mill Road. and some reputed to have occurred at the cottages at the Huntington Sheraton Library. Now, everybody is familiar, library, Huntington Sheraton Hotel, thank you, thank you. I was so excited about this next one, I got carried away. Everybody's familiar with the JonBenet Ramsey case in Colorado. We had our own version of that back in 1931 with the mysterious death of young Lewis Riley, who was a very athletic, nice-looking young man of 18, lived in San Marino. On January 5th, 1931, his dead body was discovered right in the intersection of Huntington Drive and Chelsea. Initially, they thought that he was a victim of a hit and run, but an autopsy of his body showed that it was suspicious. The injuries just were not consistent with being the victim of a hit and run. Our police department did an investigation and found out that his father, Charles Riley, was unemployed. And when he was working, he worked at the Las Encinas Sanitarium, as it was called in those days. The mother was estranged, living on the East Coast, and we suspected that it may have been family members, but we were never able to prove that. So it's a mystery that's never been solved, is the death of Lewis Riley. You're probably also aware that home invasion robberies are a phenomenon of the 1990s, right? Not exactly. The first recorded home invasion robbery occurred at February 17th, 1934, at a dinner party hosted by a Joseph Kelcher at 2950 Monterey Road. Masked gunmen broke into the house. They stole the mink coats of all the women there, stole all their jewelry, stole everybody's money. A couple days before that, they did the same thing at a home in Pasadena, owned by the principal of Marshall High School. A few months after that, these same suspects did another home invasion robbery at 1684 Windsor, the home of a Mr. Bell, and those suspects were never caught. Now, in a case that's known to generations of San Marino police officers, and probably the most highly publicized case ever to occur in this community. It received front page attention on the LA Times. The article here, a popular magazine of the era, was Official Detective Stories. And the article is reprinted up there in its entirety if you want to get more details later. But Herbert Ivy and his daughter-in-law is here tonight, correct? You get the, oh, raise your hand so everybody can stare at you and make you feel bad. Okay. His daughter is here tonight at 1590 Shenandoah Road. Picture of the house then and now is up on the bulletin board. Herbert Ivy was president of the Citizens Trust Bank, Citizens Trust and Savings Bank. One night, he and his wife were at home, received a phone call that they needed to deliver an important package from Citizens Bank to his home. He thought it was odd, but when the delivery man came to the house, he said, "You need to come outside and open this package yourself. It's a requirement." And he was suspicious and said, "No, you open it." Guy immediately pulled out a gun and says, "Come outside or you're dead." Well, Mrs. Ivy, not Mr. Ivy, Mrs. Ivy slammed the door in the suspect's face. Suspect ran down the street, jumped into a car, and was driven away at a high rate of speed. He thought he had been saved. But a couple days later, he gets an extortion note. And the suspect identifies himself as part of a gang of 10, and it doesn't matter if a couple of them die, but he wants $72,000, and if he doesn't get it, every member of Herbert Ivy's family is going to die, and one person from every branch, there were 36 of them, branch of the bank. So it began a 2-week period of terror where there were instructions, there were notes where the Ivys would have to drive around the San Gabriel Valley area. At one point, a San Marino police officer with a fully automatic weapon hid in the rumble seat of Mr. Ivy's car. It was propped open so he could breathe, and they were followed. But after picking up a series of 6 ransom notes, the last ransom note says, "You can go home now, we're all done." The next day, they get a call from one of the gang members who says, "We saw the officer in the rumble seat with the shotgun. We saw all the police cars following you. If you try that again, a member of your family is going to die." So this went on, and it was noteworthy because it was one of the first times that the Federal Crime Lab back in Washington, D.C. was called into the scene, and they did hair and fiber samples and fingerprint samples and analyzed the typewriter that the ransom notes were written on. But the bottom line, after 2 weeks of this, the San Marino Police Department, we had a license number at that point, saw the suspect as Mr. Ivy. Actually, there was a San Marino police officer dressed up as Mr. Ivy driving around, picking up these ransom notes. Saw the suspect pulling away from a curb down at Atlantic and can't remember the cross street. But our police officers rammed the suspect into the side of the road. There was no pursuit. Just crashed into him. Officer Perry Archer got out of the car, went over, says, "Put your hands up." Suspect got out of the car and shot Officer Perry Archer right through the badge. And his badge, we still have Perry Archer's badge. It's right above the shotgun I showed you earlier with the bullet hole still in it. It went through the badge, went around the rib, lodged in the shoulder, but the suspect was killed and died a few days later. So it came to a nice conclusion. We only had one suspect in custody, and the papers reported that he was probably a lone wolf to begin with, and that was the end of that story. But absolutely received nationwide publicity. The 1940s was an era of wartime hoarding in San Marino. There were a lot of underground fuel tanks. There was one family where the father was arrested right on El Molino, behind where Gene Orlowski's chiropractic office is now. There was a meat shortage, and there was a man back there who raised both chickens and rabbits. And he was arrested for selling rabbit meat as chicken meat. A pretty big crime in World War II. We had blackouts in Lacey Park, which was by now no longer a lake, but it was in fact a park, was inhabited by GIs. And the police department constantly had to go up there and keep the young schoolgirls from crawling over the fence and flirting with all the soldiers that were bivouacked there. Now, on another story that has nothing to do with crime, but I like it anyway, and I didn't think you'd believe me, so I put the article here. The biggest issue facing the city in 1949 was the lack of business parking on Huntington Drive. Now, businesses were up in arms because there was insufficient parking to open up a business. Now, if you're a member of the Chamber of Commerce, you can appreciate this story. So you can rest assured that your bureaucrats in City Hall have been working on this problem for almost 50 years now. And I have good authority, we have council members tonight, that we are to a solution, and that's what